The autumn winds of 1513 swept through the hills of Sant'Andrea, carrying with them the scent of dying leaves and the weight of political upheaval that had consumed Florence for decades. In his modest study, illuminated by flickering candlelight, Niccolò Machiavelli bent over parchment, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision as he committed to paper the observations that would reshape political thought for centuries to come. The sounds of distant conflict echoed across the Tuscan landscape, a constant reminder of the brutal realities that governed the rise and fall of princes, republics, and empires. Machiavelli understood, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries, that the art of remaining unflinching in disputes was not merely a matter of personal courage or stubborn determination. It was, rather, a carefully cultivated strategic philosophy rooted in the fundamental recognition that power, once questioned or shown to waver, begins its inevitable decline toward irrelevance. His years serving the Florentine Republic, witnessing the machinations of Cesare Borgia, and observing the delicate dance between Pope Julius II and the various Italian city-states had taught him that those who bend too easily in the face of opposition often find themselves broken entirely. The foundation of Machiavelli's unflinching approach rested upon a profound understanding of human nature itself. Men, he had observed through countless diplomatic encounters and political crises, were fundamentally driven by self-interest, fear, and the desire for security. They respected strength and despised weakness, not out of any moral consideration, but because strength provided certainty while weakness invited chaos. In the courts of Milan and Rome, he had watched as rulers who showed the slightest hesitation in their resolve found themselves surrounded by vultures, each seeking to exploit the perceived vulnerability for their own advancement. The strategy of remaining unflinching, however, required far more than mere stubbornness or an inflexible adherence to initial positions. Machiavelli recognized that true strategic inflexibility was, paradoxically, built upon a foundation of deep adaptability in methods while maintaining absolute consistency in fundamental objectives. The prince who remained unflinching in disputes was not the one who never changed his tactics, but rather the one who never allowed his opponents to perceive any weakening in his ultimate determination to achieve his goals. During his diplomatic mission to the court of Emperor Maximilian in 1507, Machiavelli had witnessed firsthand how the emperor's reputation for vacillation had undermined his authority throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Local princes and bishops who should have trembled at imperial displeasure instead calculated the odds of successful resistance, knowing that Maximilian's threats were often empty and his resolve frequently crumbled under pressure. The contrast with rulers like Ferdinand of Aragon, who maintained an iron consistency in his opposition to French expansion regardless of the personal cost, was stark and instructive. The psychological dimension of unflinching resolve formed perhaps the most crucial element of Machiavelli's strategic framework. He understood that disputes, whether between nations, within courts, or among merchants, were as much contests of will as they were negotiations over specific terms or territories. The party that first showed signs of weakening their position, that first suggested they might accept less than their stated demands, had already conceded the most important point in any negotiation, that their position was not, in fact, non-negotiable. This principle extended beyond formal diplomatic encounters to encompass the entire range of political relationships. In the councils of Florence, Machiavelli had observed how citizens and patricians alike would test the resolve of their opponents through seemingly minor challenges and requests. A leader who accommodated too readily on small matters would soon find himself facing increasingly audacious demands, as his reputation for flexibility became a liability rather than an asset. The unflinching leader, by contrast, established early and consistently that certain principles and positions were simply not subject to negotiation, regardless of the pressure applied. Yet Machiavelli's conception of unflinching resolve was far from the blind obstinacy that characterized many failed leaders of his era. He distinguished carefully between strategic inflexibility and tactical stupidity, recognizing that the most effective practitioners of unflinching dispute resolution were those who understood precisely which elements of their position were truly essential and which were merely convenient. The skill lay in identifying the core interests that could never be compromised while maintaining sufficient flexibility in peripheral matters to give opponents face-saving alternatives and the illusion of meaningful concessions. The preparation required for maintaining such resolve extended far beyond the moment of confrontation itself. Machiavelli emphasized the importance of building what he termed the foundations of inflexibility long before any specific dispute arose. These foundations included the careful cultivation of alliances with parties whose interests aligned with one's core objectives, the accumulation of resources sufficient to weather prolonged periods of conflict, and the establishment of a reputation for reliability among supporters and implacability among opponents. In his analysis of Cesare Borgia's campaigns, Machiavelli noted how the Duke of Valentinois had spent months preparing for his confrontation with the Orsini family, not merely by gathering military forces, but by ensuring that his unflinching position would be sustainable regardless of how the conflict developed. Borgia had secured alternative supply lines, cultivated relationships with potential allies who might emerge during the conflict, and, most importantly, had structured his demands in such a way that accepting them would actually strengthen his position for future disputes, while rejecting them would justify the complete destruction of his opponents. The timing of unflinching positions represented another crucial element of Machiavelli's strategic thinking. He observed that the most effective practitioners of this approach understood the rhythm of political conflict, recognizing when circumstances favored absolute intransigence and when tactical flexibility might better serve long-term strategic inflexibility. The leader who took unbending positions on every minor issue would exhaust both his own resources and the patience of his supporters, while the leader who reserved such positions for truly crucial moments would find them far more effective when deployed. The communication of unflinching resolve required particular skill and attention to detail. Machiavelli noted that the most successful practitioners of this strategy were those who could convey absolute determination without appearing unreasonable or aggressive. The art lay in presenting one's position as the natural and inevitable result of immutable principles rather than personal stubbornness or emotional attachment. By framing inflexibility as a matter of principle rather than personality, skilled leaders could maintain their positions while avoiding the appearance of irrationality that might drive potential allies away. The role of reputation in sustaining unflinching resolve formed a central theme in Machiavelli's analysis. He understood that each dispute, regardless of its specific subject matter or immediate importance, contributed to the broader perception of a leader's character and reliability. A reputation for unwavering determination in conflicts, once established, became a valuable asset that could deter future challenges and strengthen one's position in subsequent negotiations. Conversely, a single instance of backing down from a publicly stated position could undermine years of carefully cultivated credibility. This dynamic created what Machiavelli recognized as the paradox of inflexibility, that the leader who was known for never compromising would often find that his opponents were more willing to offer real concessions, knowing that partial measures would be insufficient to move him from his position. The reputation for unflinching resolve thus became self-reinforcing, as opponents learned to approach such leaders with their best offers rather than testing the waters with inadequate proposals. The selection of issues on which to remain unflinching required careful strategic calculation. Machiavelli emphasized that effective leaders must distinguish between matters of fundamental importance to their long-term objectives and those that, while perhaps emotionally satisfying to contest, did not warrant the expenditure of political capital and reputation that absolute positions required. The leader who chose his battles wisely could maintain an image of principled inflexibility while actually being quite selective about when to deploy this valuable resource. Throughout his observations of Italian politics, Machiavelli had noted how the most successful rulers were those who understood the interconnected nature of all political disputes. Each conflict existed within a broader context of relationships, obligations, and future challenges that would be affected by how the current disagreement was resolved. The unflinching leader was therefore not simply someone who refused to compromise on the immediate issue at hand, but someone who understood how maintaining his position in the current dispute would affect his ability to achieve his objectives in future conflicts. The cultivation of supporters who could sustain an unflinching position during periods of pressure formed another crucial element of Machiavelli's strategic framework. He recognized that even the most determined leader would face moments when the immediate costs of maintaining his position seemed to outweigh the benefits, and that having advisors and allies who understood the long-term strategic value of consistency could provide crucial support during such difficult periods. These supporters needed to be carefully selected for their understanding of the leader's broader objectives rather than their personal loyalty alone, as the strategy required intellectual commitment to the approach rather than merely emotional attachment to the leader. Part 2, The Mechanics of Strategic Inflexibility. The morning light filtering through the narrow windows of the Palazzo Vecchio revealed the intricate web of relationships and obligations that governed Florentine politics in the early years of the 16th century. As Machiavelli made his way through the corridors where he had once wielded considerable influence, he reflected upon the mechanical precision required to transform the philosophical foundation of unflinching resolve into practical political action. The art of remaining immovable in disputes was not, he had come to understand, a matter of simple determination, but rather a complex orchestration of timing, communication, resource management, and psychological manipulation that required constant attention and adjustment. The first mechanical element of strategic inflexibility concerned the careful construction of positions that could actually be maintained under pressure. Machiavelli had observed too many leaders who took absolutist stances on issues without adequate consideration of whether they possessed the resources, allies, and strategic depth necessary to sustain such positions when challenged. The effective practitioner of unflinching resolve began not with public declarations of intransigence, but with private assessment of his own capabilities and limitations, ensuring that any position he claimed as non-negotiable could indeed be defended against the most determined opposition. This preparatory phase required what Machiavelli termed the mapping of dependencies, a systematic analysis of all the factors that would influence one's ability to maintain a given position. These included not only obvious elements such as military strength and financial resources, but also the more subtle considerations of alliance relationships, public opinion, seasonal factors that might affect supply lines or troop movements, and the personal motivations and constraints facing one's opponents. Only when this mapping was complete could a leader confidently adopt the posture of inflexibility, knowing that he possessed genuine rather than merely apparent strength. The Duke of Urbino's failed attempt to resist Cesare Borgia's expansion provided Machiavelli with a perfect illustration of the dangers of unfounded inflexibility. The Duke had declared his territory inviolable and his independence non-negotiable, positions that might have been sustainable if he had possessed adequate military forces, reliable allies, and secure supply lines. Instead, his unflinching stance was built upon nothing more substantial than historical precedent and personal pride, foundations that crumbled rapidly when subjected to Borgia's systematic pressure. The Duke's inflexibility, rather than deterring his opponent, had simply made his eventual defeat more complete and humiliating. The timing of unflinching positions represented perhaps the most delicate aspect of their mechanical implementation. Machiavelli recognized that the effectiveness of such positions depended heavily upon when they were adopted and communicated. Positions taken too early in a developing conflict might provoke unnecessary escalation or unite otherwise divided opponents, while positions taken too late might appear reactive and defensive rather than principled and proactive. The skilled practitioner of strategic inflexibility possessed an almost instinctive sense for the moment when circumstances had developed sufficiently to make an unbending stance both necessary and sustainable. The case of Pope Julius II's confrontation with the Bentivoglio family in Bologna demonstrated the importance of such timing. The Pope had long harbored intentions to bring Bologna under direct papal control, but he had waited until the broader political situation in Italy provided the optimal moment for action. French influence was waning, the Venetians were distracted by their own conflicts, and the Holy Roman Empire was too distant to provide effective intervention. Only when these conditions aligned did Julius adopt his famously inflexible position that the Bentivoglio must submit completely or be destroyed entirely. The timing transformed what might have been a difficult and costly campaign into a relatively straightforward assertion of papal authority. The communication of unflinching positions required equally precise mechanical consideration. Machiavelli observed that the most effective practitioners understood that such communications were never simple statements of fact, but rather complex signals that conveyed multiple layers of meaning to different audiences simultaneously. The primary target of the communication was obviously the immediate opponent, but equally important were the various allies, neutral parties, and potential future adversaries who would observe and interpret the leader's stance. Each of these audiences needed to receive slightly different messages, all consistent with the central position but emphasizing different aspects of its justification and implications. The language used to communicate inflexible positions required particular care and sophistication. Machiavelli noted that crude threats or emotional declarations of determination often backfired by provoking unnecessary resistance or making the leader appear unstable and unreliable. More effective was language that presented the unflinching position as the natural and inevitable result of immutable principles, circumstances, or obligations that placed the matter beyond the leader's personal discretion. This approach allowed opponents to retreat without losing face by acknowledging the force of external constraints rather than submitting to personal domination. Francesco Gonzaga's handling of territorial disputes with Venice exemplified this sophisticated approach to communication. Rather than declaring his personal determination to resist Venetian expansion, Gonzaga consistently framed his inflexibility in terms of his obligations to the Holy Roman Empire, his duty to his subjects, and the ancient rights of his family. This framing allowed the Venetians to acknowledge the legitimacy of his position even while disagreeing with it, creating space for face-saving compromises that preserved Gonzaga's essential interests while allowing Venice to claim that they were respecting legitimate obligations rather than yielding to superior force. The management of internal pressures represented another crucial mechanical element of sustaining unflinching positions. Machiavelli recognized that even the most determined leader would face pressure from advisors, allies, and supporters who would counsel moderation or compromise as conflicts intensified and costs mounted. The effective practitioner of strategic inflexibility needed mechanisms for managing these internal pressures without either completely suppressing valuable counsel or allowing the appearance of uncertainty to undermine his position. This required what Machiavelli called the architecture of consultation, a systematic approach to seeking and receiving advice that preserved the leader's image of unwavering determination while still allowing for the consideration of alternative perspectives. The most successful leaders created formal and informal channels through which advisors could present their concerns and suggestions privately, while maintaining absolute consistency in their public communications about their non-negotiable positions. This separation between private deliberation and public presentation allowed for tactical adjustments and strategic refinements without compromising the fundamental integrity of the unflinching stance. The role of intermediaries in maintaining unflinching positions formed another important mechanical consideration. Machiavelli observed that direct communication between principals who had adopted incompatible and flexible positions often led to escalation and eventual violence, as neither party could afford to be seen backing down in face-to-face confrontation. Skilled practitioners of strategic inflexibility therefore cultivated networks of trusted intermediaries who could explore potential solutions and communicate subtle adjustments in position without requiring the principals to modify their public stances. These intermediaries needed to be carefully selected and managed, as they wielded considerable influence over the eventual resolution of conflicts. They required sufficient status and credibility to be taken seriously by all parties, enough independence to avoid appearing as mere mouthpieces for their principals, and sufficient understanding of their principals' true objectives to identify genuinely acceptable solutions. The relationship between the principal and his intermediaries also needed to be structured in such a way that any concessions or flexibility they displayed could be attributed to their own initiative rather than instructions from their principal, preserving the leader's reputation for inflexibility even when tactical accommodations were made. Ludovico Sforza's use of intermediaries in his disputes with the French crown demonstrated both the potential and the pitfalls of this approach. Sforza had maintained a public position of absolute opposition to French claims on the Duchy of Milan while privately authorizing his representatives to explore various forms of accommodation that might preserve his essential interests. This strategy worked effectively for several years, allowing him to maintain his position of strength while avoiding the costs of direct confrontation. However, when his intermediaries were eventually perceived as operating beyond their authority, the revelation undermined both his credibility and his negotiating position, contributing to his eventual downfall. The escalation management formed perhaps the most technically demanding aspect of implementing unflinching strategies. Machiavelli understood that opponents faced with truly inflexible positions would often resort to increasingly aggressive pressure tactics, creating the risk that minor disputes would spiral into major conflicts with consequences far beyond the original issues at stake. The skilled practitioner of strategic inflexibility needed mechanisms for absorbing and redirecting such pressure without either abandoning his position or allowing the conflict to escape his control. This required sophisticated understanding of what Machiavelli termed pressure valves, ways of allowing opponents to express their frustration and demonstrate their own resolve without directly challenging the leader's core position. These might include offering symbolic concessions on peripheral issues, creating opportunities for opponents to claim partial victories on matters that did not affect the fundamental dispute, or providing alternative targets for aggressive action that would satisfy the opponent's need to appear strong without undermining the leader's essential interests. The Venetian approach to Ottoman pressure in the Eastern Mediterranean provided an excellent example of sophisticated escalation management. Faced with Ottoman demands that they considered fundamentally unacceptable, the Venetians had developed a complex system of partial concessions, face-saving gestures, and alternative arrangements that allowed the Ottomans to demonstrate their power and achieve some of their objectives without forcing Venice to abandon its core interests. This approach required constant attention and adjustment, but it successfully prevented the kind of total confrontation that would have been catastrophic for Venetian interests. The resource allocation required to sustain unflinching positions represented another crucial mechanical consideration. Such positions were inherently expensive, requiring not only the obvious costs of military preparation and diplomatic activity, but also the less visible expenses of maintaining intelligence networks, supporting allies, and compensating for the economic disruption that prolonged conflicts inevitably caused. The leader who adopted unflinching positions without adequate financial planning would soon find himself forced to compromise not from lack of will, but from simple inability to continue paying the costs of his stance. This financial dimension required careful long-term planning and the development of revenue sources that would be sustainable even under the stress of prolonged conflict. Machiavelli noted that the most successful practitioners of strategic inflexibility were those who had built their financial foundations during periods of relative peace, creating reserves and establishing relationships that would provide support during times of crisis. They also understood the importance of structuring their positions in ways that minimized ongoing costs while maximizing the expenses that their inflexibility imposed upon their opponents. The psychological maintenance of unflinching resolve, both for the leader himself and for his key supporters, formed the final crucial mechanical element of the strategy. Machiavelli recognized that human beings were not naturally suited to maintaining absolute positions under intense pressure, and that even the most determined individuals would experience moments of doubt, fatigue, and temptation to compromise. The effective practitioner of strategic inflexibility needed mechanisms for reinforcing his own determination and that of his key supporters during these inevitable periods of weakness. This psychological maintenance required both intellectual and emotional components. On the intellectual level, leaders needed regular reminders of why their inflexible position served their long-term interests, systematic analysis of the progress they were making toward their objectives, and realistic assessment of the costs of abandoning their position compared to the benefits of maintaining it. On the emotional level, they needed sources of encouragement, validation, and support that could sustain them through the inevitable periods when their resolve would be tested. The most successful practitioners developed what Machiavelli called rituals of reinforcement, regular practices that renewed their commitment to their unflinching positions and strengthened their resolve for continued resistance. These might include private reflection on the principles that justified their stance, consultation with trusted advisors who understood the strategic importance of consistency, or even symbolic actions that publicly reaffirmed their determination and made retreat more difficult. Part 3, The Mastery of Enduring Victory. As the bells of San Lorenzo echoed across Florence in the gathering dusk, Machiavelli contemplated the ultimate test of his strategic philosophy, the transformation of momentary tactical success into lasting political advantage. He had witnessed countless leaders who had successfully maintained unflinching positions in specific disputes only to find that their victories proved hollow, creating new enemies without establishing enduring security, or achieving immediate objectives while undermining their long-term strategic position. The true mastery of unflinching resolve lay not merely in winning individual confrontations, but in structuring those victories in ways that strengthened one's position for all future conflicts while creating sustainable foundations for lasting power. The essential principle underlying enduring victory was what Machiavelli termed the architecture of aftermath, the systematic planning for how the resolution of current disputes would affect future relationships, challenges, and opportunities. Too many leaders, he observed, became so focused on achieving their immediate objectives that they neglected to consider how their methods of victory would influence their ability to govern, negotiate, or project power in the years that followed. The leader who crushed his opponents through inflexible determination but left them with burning resentment and nothing to lose had merely postponed rather than resolved his difficulties. The case of Cesare Borgia's conquest of the Romagna provided both positive and negative lessons in this regard. Borgia had demonstrated masterful unflinching resolve in his initial campaigns, refusing to accept anything less than complete submission from local strongmen and maintaining his positions despite intense pressure from various quarters. His inflexibility had indeed achieved its immediate objectives, bringing the entire region under his control with remarkable speed and efficiency. However, his failure to properly structure the aftermath of these victories contributed to the rapid collapse of his power following his father's death, as he had created enemies without establishing the institutional foundations necessary for sustainable rule. The construction of such enduring victories required careful attention to what Machiavelli called the psychology of the defeated. Leaders who had been forced to submit to inflexible demands would naturally seek opportunities for revenge unless they were either completely destroyed or provided with compelling reasons to accept their new circumstances. The skilled practitioner of strategic inflexibility understood that total destruction was rarely practical or desirable, while simple humiliation was almost invariably counterproductive. Instead, the most effective approach involved creating conditions under which former opponents could find dignity, profit, or security within the new arrangement. This required sophisticated understanding of the motivations and constraints that drove opposing leaders. In many cases, their resistance to initial demands stemmed not from fundamental disagreement with the substance of those demands, but from concerns about their own survival, reputation, or ability to maintain the loyalty of their followers. The leader who structured his victory in ways that addressed these underlying concerns while maintaining his essential objectives could transform defeated opponents into valuable allies or at least neutral parties unlikely to cause future difficulties. The Venetian Republic's handling of defeated rivals and their expansion across the Italian mainland demonstrated this principle in action. Rather than simply imposing harsh terms on conquered territories, the Venetians typically offered local elites opportunities to maintain their social position and economic interests within the expanded Venetian state. Former enemies who accepted these arrangements often became some of Venice's most reliable administrators and military commanders, as they understood that their continued prosperity depended upon Venetian success. This approach transformed military conquest into political integration, creating lasting strength rather than merely temporary dominance. The timing of concessions and accommodations represented another crucial element in constructing enduring victories. Machiavelli observed that gestures of magnanimity were most effective when they came from a position of unquestioned strength, appearing as voluntary acts of statesmanship rather than signs of weakness or uncertainty. The leader who had maintained an absolutely inflexible position throughout a dispute and, then, achieved complete victory was in an ideal position to offer unexpected concessions that would be received with gratitude rather than seen as evidence that further pressure might yield additional benefits. This dynamic created what Machiavelli termed the paradox of generous victory, whereby the leader who had been most inflexible during the conflict could afford to be most accommodating in its aftermath, precisely because his determination had been so thoroughly demonstrated. Such generosity, when properly timed and structured, could accomplish more toward securing lasting victory than the most comprehensive military triumph, as it addressed the defeated party's need for dignity and hope while demonstrating the victor's confidence in his own position. The establishment of institutional mechanisms for managing future disputes formed another essential component of enduring victory. Machiavelli recognized that even the most complete triumph in a specific conflict would prove temporary if it did not create systems for preventing or managing similar disputes in the future. The leader who simply imposed his will through inflexible determination without establishing ongoing mechanisms for communication, negotiation, and conflict resolution would find himself forced to repeat the process endlessly, exhausting his resources and, eventually, undermining his position. These institutional mechanisms needed to serve multiple functions simultaneously. They had to provide defeated parties with channels for expressing their concerns and grievances without directly challenging the victor's authority, create opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation that would give all parties stakes in maintaining the new arrangement, and establish clear procedures for addressing future disagreements before they escalated into major conflicts. Most importantly, these institutions needed to be structured in ways that preserved the victor's essential interests while providing enough flexibility to accommodate changing circumstances and new challenges. The papal administration of the patrimony of St. Peter under Julius II illustrated both the potential and the limitations of such institutional approaches. The Pope had successfully employed inflexible determination to bring rebellious territories under direct papal control, but he had also established administrative systems that provided local interests with meaningful representation and opportunities for advancement within the papal hierarchy. These arrangements proved remarkably durable, surviving several changes in papal leadership and maintaining stability even during periods of broader Italian turmoil. However, they required constant attention and adjustment, as local interests continuously tested the boundaries of papal authority and sought to expand their autonomy. The cultivation of what Machiavelli called the ecology of power represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of constructing enduring victories. This involved understanding how changes in one's own position would affect the broader balance of relationships among all relevant political actors, and structuring victories in ways that created stability rather than merely shifting the sources of instability. A victory that dramatically enhanced one's own power while creating dangerous power vacuums or forcing natural allies into opposition would prove self-defeating regardless of its immediate completeness. This ecological thinking required leaders to consider not only their immediate opponents, but also the complex web of relationships, dependencies, and rivalries that connected all relevant political actors. The most enduring victories were those that strengthened existing stabilizing relationships while weakening destabilizing ones, creating incentives for cooperation among natural allies while dividing potential hostile coalitions. This often meant accepting something less than maximum possible advantage in specific disputes in order to achieve more comprehensive and sustainable improvements in one's overall strategic position. The French experience in Italy during the early 16th century provided numerous examples of victories that failed this ecological test. French military superiority had enabled them to achieve spectacular tactical successes and imposed their will upon various Italian states through inflexible determination and superior force. However, their methods of victory consistently alienated natural allies, united diverse opponents in common resistance, and created power vacuums that drew in additional competitors. Each French triumph thus created the conditions for renewed conflict, ultimately resulting in their expulsion from the peninsula despite their initial advantages. The management of success itself formed another crucial element in achieving enduring victory. Machiavelli observed that many leaders who had successfully employed unflinching resolve in specific disputes subsequently undermined their achievements through overconfidence, complacency, or misunderstanding of how their enhanced position should be employed. Victory in a single confrontation, no matter how complete, was merely an opportunity to build something more lasting, not an end in itself. This required what Machiavelli termed the discipline of victory, the ability to maintain the same careful analysis, strategic thinking, and attention to detail that had produced success even when immediate pressures had been relieved. The leader who relaxed his vigilance after achieving victory, who assumed that his enhanced reputation for inflexibility would automatically deter future challenges, or who began to confuse tactical success with strategic invincibility was setting himself up for eventual failure. The maintenance of the alliances and relationships that had made victory possible represented a particularly important aspect of this discipline. Many of these relationships had been formed under the pressure of immediate necessity and required ongoing attention to remain viable once that pressure was removed. Allies who had supported an inflexible position during a crisis needed to see continuing benefits from that support, while neutral parties who had not opposed the successful leader needed incentives to maintain their neutrality in future disputes. The development of successors and institutional continuity formed the ultimate test of enduring victory. Machiavelli understood that even the most personally successful leader was mortal, and that victories built entirely upon individual determination and reputation would prove ephemeral unless they were institutionalized in ways that could survive transitions in leadership. This required not only the establishment of formal procedures and structures, but also the cultivation of individuals who understood and could continue implementing the strategic principles that had produced success. This succession planning needed to address both the technical and the psychological aspects of unflinching resolve. Future leaders needed to understand not only the specific tactics and methods that had proven effective, but also the underlying strategic principles that made inflexibility effective in some circumstances while potentially counterproductive in others. They needed to develop their own reputations for determination and consistency while understanding how to adapt established approaches to new challenges and changing circumstances. The Roman approach to incorporating conquered territories provided perhaps the most enduring example of how unflinching determination in specific conflicts could be transformed into lasting institutional arrangements. Roman inflexibility in demanding submission was legendary, but equally important was their systematic approach to integrating defeated enemies into the Roman system in ways that made future rebellion both difficult and unnecessary. The Roman citizenship pathway, military service opportunities, and administrative positions provided former enemies with compelling reasons to support rather than resist Roman authority, transforming military conquest into political integration that lasted for centuries. As Machiavelli reflected upon these patterns of enduring victory, he recognized that the ultimate measure of strategic inflexibility was not the completeness of any single triumph, but the cumulative effect of consistent application over time. The leader who understood when and how to be inflexible, who could maintain unwavering resolve under pressure while adapting his methods to changing circumstances, and who could transform tactical victories into lasting strategic advantages would find that his reputation for inflexibility became one of his most valuable assets, deterring challenges while creating opportunities for peaceful achievement of objectives. The true mastery of unflinching resolve thus lay not in never compromising, but in understanding so clearly what could never be compromised that all other matters became subjects for tactical flexibility and strategic accommodation. The leader who achieved this mastery would find that his inflexibility, rather than limiting his options, actually expanded them by establishing clear boundaries that allowed all parties to operate with confidence and, by creating a reputation for reliability that made negotiation and cooperation more rather than less likely. In the quiet of his study, as Florence settled into another uneasy night of political uncertainty, Machiavelli understood that he had witnessed the operation of these principles in the careers of the great leaders of his time, both in their successes and in their failures. The lessons were clear for those who possessed the wisdom to learn from them. Unflinching resolve, properly understood and skillfully applied, was indeed the foundation of lasting political success, but only when it served broader strategic objectives rather than becoming an end in itself. The leader who mastered this distinction would find in it the key not merely to winning disputes, but to building the kind of enduring power that could survive the inevitable challenges and changes that time would bring. This analysis of Machiavelli's strategic thinking regarding unflinching resolve in disputes draws upon historical examples from his era while exploring the timeless principles that made such approaches effective. The document illustrates how tactical inflexibility, when properly understood and implemented, could serve broader strategic objectives of lasting political success and institutional stability.